Deep in North America's wildest forests, seasoned hunters faced moments when the predator suddenly became the prey. From sudden wolf ambushes to eerie encounters with strangers in the woods, these 6 stories are guaranteed to send a chill down your spine. Experience the thin line between triumph and terror as hunters battle nature's fiercest challenges. This is the untold side of the hunt, where survival instincts are pushed to the brink. Ethan Ross had spent over 20 years hunting in Alaska's mountains, a rugged expanse of jagged peaks, dark timber, and endless valleys, where danger always lurked just beyond the next ridge. At 47, with streaks of gray in his beard and eyes hardened by countless seasons in the wild, he considered himself prepared for anything. He had come out alone for black bear hunting in early July during Alaska's legal open season, choosing a secluded log cabin that sat a mile off an old logging road, knowing it would keep him close to the bear trails he had scouted in the spring. His gear was impeccable. A stainless steel .338 Winchester Magnum bolt-action rifle, topped with a sturdy magnification of 2 to 10 times, a 10-inch Bowie knife strapped to his belt, bear spray clipped to his chest harness, and enough supplies to last a week. His plan was simple: to spend days glassing berry patches and nights resting in the cabin, rising before dawn to check bait stations and track fresh sign. On July 8th, he had quartered a black bear he had harvested in the evening, carefully hanging the meat in a tall spruce near the cabin to keep it away from scavengers. He washed his hands and gear meticulously, but even a hint of blood in these woods was enough to catch the attention of every predator within miles. As darkness fell on the night of July 9th, Ethan cleaned his rifle on the cabin table by lamplight, satisfied with the day's success, but aware that grizzlies roamed these hills and might come looking for an easy meal. He made sure the door was bolted, windows latched, and his rifle loaded before stretching out on his cot, exhausted but alert. The night air outside was still and heavy, filled with the distant calls of owls and the gentle rustle of wind through spruce needles. A half-moon hung low, casting pale light through the gaps between the thick branches. Ethan's sleep was restless, his mind half drifting and half straining to catch any unnatural sound in the forest's hushed symphony. At around 2 o'clock in the morning, a sudden sharp crack of a breaking branch jolted him fully awake, the kind of sound that carried unmistakable weight and purpose. He lay frozen, every sense reaching out beyond the thin cabin walls. The next noise was the soft crunch of massive paws shifting on gravel outside the cabin door, followed by a deep, rumbling huff that vibrated in his chest and sent adrenaline coursing through his veins. The old wooden door shuddered as a colossal shadow pressed against it, the hinges creaking under the strain. Ethan grabbed his rifle from beside the cot, chambered around with a quiet but deliberate motion, and tried to steady his breathing as the beast outside began snuffling around the base of the door, the wet, guttural breaths of a grizzly, unmistakable to anyone who had spent time in bear country. He could almost picture it, a massive boar, probably well over 800 pounds, drawn in by the lingering scent of blood and meat, despite Ethan's best efforts to keep a clean camp. The first blow landed with a thunderous crack, the bear's weight slamming into the door with astonishing force that splintered wood and rattled the entire cabin, knocking a pot from its hook and sending it clattering to the floor. The door held for a moment longer as Ethan crouched behind his cot, trying to use the thick bed frame as cover while aiming at the weakening hinges. He had seen what a grizzly could do to a man caught in the open and knew that inside the cabin he had precious few options if the bear broke through. Another massive strike buckled the door inward, a gaping crack splitting the wood and revealing a sliver of the bear's broad, fur-matted shoulder in the moonlight. The cabin filled with the smell of damp fur and raw animal musk. Ethan's heart hammered as he forced himself to wait for the right shot, not wanting to risk a wild miss in the chaos. A final blow tore the door from its hinges, sending it crashing inside with a shower of splinters. The bear roared as it forced its massive head and shoulders through the frame, eyes glinting with predatory rage. Ethan squeezed the trigger, the muzzle flash briefly lighting the cabin like a lightning strike as the first shot smashed into the bear's chest, staggering it but failing to stop its charge. The grizzly roared in pain, rearing up so its head nearly scraped the low ceiling, claws slashing wildly as it tried to find the source of its torment. Ethan cycled the bolt as fast as he could, his hands slick with sweat, and fired again, this time striking higher in the bear's neck. The grizzly crashed sideways into the table, splintering it to pieces, but kept thrashing, massive paws swinging through the air with bone-breaking power. The confined space amplified every sound into deafening chaos as the bear roared, knocked over gear, and clawed at anything it could reach. Ethan retreated behind the overturned cot, trying to find a clear shot while the bear battered the thin interior walls. He fired a third round into the bear's shoulder, the impact flipping the beast onto its side, but it clawed back to its feet with shocking speed, rage and pain twisting its massive face into a mask of primal fury. Ethan felt the cabin shake as the bear crashed against the walls, slamming its bulk into the cot and sending it skidding across the floor, leaving him exposed. He forced himself to stay calm, reloading as quickly as he could while the bear panted raggedly, bleeding heavily but refusing to give up. With one final, desperate lunge, the bear surged forward, jaws snapping inches from Ethan's legs. He jammed the rifle barrel against the bear's throat and fired point blank, the final shot tearing through vital organs and ending the attack in an instant. The grizzly collapsed in a massive heap that blocked half the doorway, the cabin falling eerily silent except for Ethan's ragged, gasping breaths. The acrid smell of gunpowder and the thick, coppery scent of blood hung heavy in the air. Ethan slumped against the wall, hands trembling as the reality of what had just happened settled in, the adrenaline draining from his body and leaving only bone-deep exhaustion and a haunting awareness of how close he had come to dying alone in the dark heart of the Alaskan wilderness. When dawn broke, pale light spilling across the mountains and into the shattered cabin, Ethan stepped outside to see the silent forest bathed in gold. The events of the night felt like a fevered dream, but the massive, lifeless grizzly at his feet reminded him of the truth. He knew he had done everything right, yet the wilderness had nearly claimed him, and he felt a deep respect for the raw power of nature and the thin line every hunter walked between life and death. John Prokop had always dreamed of stalking elk in the vast, rugged expanse of Montana's wilderness. At 34, he was still new to elk hunting, having only 2 seasons under his belt. But he had poured himself into learning every aspect of the pursuit, reading tracks, understanding elk calls, and mastering his .300 Winchester Magnum rifle. Late October's crisp air carried the scent of pine and damp earth as golden leaves fluttered from the aspen groves, the kind of autumn morning that filled him with hope that he might finally tag his first bull. He had risen before dawn, hiking miles into the thick timber to escape the crowds of other hunters and find elk in unpressured areas. His gear was carefully chosen, lightweight camo layers for cold mornings and warm afternoons, scent-killing spray to mask human odor, and a trusty bugle tube strapped across his chest. By late morning, John had cut fresh elk tracks weaving through a dense stand of lodgepole pines. His excitement grew as he let out soft cow calls, hoping to coax a bull into range. The forest around him was alive with the distant bugles of bulls challenging each other, a primal chorus that sent shivers of anticipation down his spine. He moved slowly, pausing often to glass the ridges and check the wind direction, knowing a swirling breeze could betray his position. Each careful step over moss and fallen branches brought him deeper into shadowy timber where sunlight barely pierced the thick canopy. His heart raced with every sound, but what he didn't know was that something else had taken an interest in his presence. It started as an uneasy feeling, the hair on his neck rising, as he realized the forest had gone unnaturally quiet. Birds had fallen silent, and even the distant bugles had faded, replaced by a sense of oppressive stillness. He shifted his rifle, scanning the dark gaps between tree trunks, but saw nothing except the dance of shadows in the gentle breeze. He pressed forward, telling himself it was just nerves, until he caught the faintest rustle behind him, a sound so soft it might have been imagined, yet perfectly in time with his own movements. His breath caught in his chest as he realized he was being followed. John tried to stay calm, using every bit of advice he had read about dealing with mountain lions. Stand tall, don't run, make yourself appear bigger. But his mind kept replaying stories of hunters mauled by the elusive predators that stalked from the shadows. He moved into a small clearing where he could see better, heart hammering as he circled slowly, scanning every ridge and fallen log. He let out an elk bugle, hoping the sudden blast of sound might startle the cat, or at least reveal its position. But the forest only swallowed his call with eerie silence. He checked the wind again, spraying more scent killer around himself, desperate to keep the advantage over elk that might still be nearby, even as his instinct screamed that elk were no longer the only concern. A flicker of movement on the edge of the clearing caught his eye, just a glimpse of tawny fur slinking low along the ground, nearly invisible against the earth. He raised his rifle, safety clicking off as he searched for a target, but the cat melted back into the timber with ghost-like stealth. Every nerve in his body burned as he realized it was testing him, probing for weakness with patient, predatory intent. He backed toward a large pine, pressing his shoulders against the trunk so nothing could circle behind him, eyes darting to every shadow. Seconds stretched into minutes as he waited, sweat trickling down his spine despite the chill. A sudden rush of motion exploded from the right as the mountain lion lunged from cover, muscles coiled in terrifying silence until its final leap. John pivoted, squeezing the trigger, just as the cat slammed into him with bone-jarring force, claws raking deep into his left thigh and hip. The rifle's muzzle flash split the dim forest as his first shot went wild, the recoil knocking him sideways into a bed of needles and rotten branches. Pain flared white-hot through his leg, but he forced himself to roll, rifle held across his chest like a shield as the cat reared back, mouth pulled into a silent snarl, yellow eyes wide with rage. He cycled the bolt with trembling hands, vision blurring as he tried to ignore the agony in his leg. The mountain lion crouched low again, muscles rippling as it prepared to spring a second time. John fought to control his breathing, knowing he had only one more chance. When the cat tensed for its final charge, he steadied his aim and fired. The .300 Winchester Magnum's recoil slamming his shoulder as the bullet struck the cat squarely in the chest, snapping its body sideways in a spray of dirt and pine needles. It skidded to a halt, limbs twitching before going still, the forest suddenly falling so quiet it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. He collapsed back against the tree, gasping as adrenaline drained away and the searing pain in his leg took center stage. Blood spread quickly through his pants, soaking into the forest floor while he fumbled for his first aid kit, hands shaking uncontrollably. He pressed gauze against the deep slashes, wincing as he cinched a tourniquet above the worst wound. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain rolling through him, but he knew he couldn't afford to pass out. He forced himself to check the cat one last time, heart sinking as he saw its size, nearly 7 feet from nose to tail, with thick, powerful limbs and razor claws stained red. The hours crawled by as he sat with his back to the tree, afraid to move too far with his injuries, but knowing he needed help. He blew his emergency whistle at intervals, praying another hunter might hear it, each blast echoing through the empty woods like a cry into the void. When afternoon light began to slant golden through the trees, he finally heard distant voices calling back. Relief broke over him like a wave, tears springing unbidden to his eyes as 2 hunters emerged from the timber, rifles ready but faces shifting to shock as they saw him slumped against the pine with blood-soaked pants and a dead mountain lion lying nearby. They helped him to his feet, supporting him as he hobbled back toward camp, every painful step a reminder of how close he had come to becoming prey instead of predator. Though he had survived, the encounter left a scar deeper than the ragged wounds in his leg, a lasting respect for the wilderness, and the understanding that even the most careful hunter could find himself stalked in the shadows of the wild. Tim Marshall had hunted elk, deer, and bear for over 30 years, but nothing in his experience prepared him for the cold November morning in Idaho's wilderness when he found himself face to face with a pack of wolves. At 53, Tim was a proud, seasoned bow hunter who knew every inch of his favorite hunting grounds and had harvested more elk with his compound bow than he could count. The sun had barely risen when he set out that morning, the frost crunching under his boots as he slipped through dark timber, every breath forming pale clouds in the frigid air. He carried his Hoyt compound bow, arrows tipped with razor-sharp broadheads, and wore layers of camo fleece to keep silent in the icy wind. He had arrowed a young cow elk just after dawn, the shot perfect behind the shoulder at 20 yards, and he tracked the blood trail to where the elk fell in a small clearing. Kneeling beside his prize, Tim felt the familiar rush of gratitude and respect he always experienced when taking an animal, knowing it would feed his family through the winter. He dressed the elk quickly, moving methodically to quarter the meat and hang it from a sturdy lodgepole pine to keep it off the ground. The scent of fresh blood was thick in the cold air, mingling with the resinous tang of pine sap, and Tim knew it could carry far through the quiet forest. He had just finished hoisting the last quarter when a strange stillness settled over the woods. Birds that had been calling fell silent, and the distant sounds of the forest seemed to vanish into an oppressive hush. He froze, listening intently, bow in hand, arrow nocked. A soft crunch of snow drifted through the stillness, too heavy for a squirrel or rabbit, and his heart sank as he scanned the tree line. Out of the shadows emerged a pair of pale eyes reflecting the dim morning light, followed by the low, slinking form of a gray wolf. Another appeared at its flank, then a third, until 5 wolves stood spaced in a wide semicircle, their heads low, ears forward, eyes fixed on him. Tim's breath came faster as he realized they were not simply curious. They were emboldened, drawn by the scent of the fresh elk and the chance for an easy meal. He slowly backed against the tree where his meat hung, trying to keep every wolf in sight, his mind racing through every predator avoidance tactic he'd learned. He raised his bow higher, making himself look as large as he could, and shouted in a low, firm voice, but the wolves did not retreat. Their eyes burned with primal hunger, and one stepped forward, lips curling to reveal yellowed fangs, a low growl rumbling from its chest. A surge of fear and determination flooded Tim as he realized he had to act. He drew his bow, aiming at the closest wolf, muscles trembling with adrenaline, and released the arrow in a smooth, practiced motion. The broadhead struck true, burying itself deep in the wolf's chest, sending it sprawling with a strangled yelp. The remaining wolves hesitated for a moment, hackles rising, then erupted into furious snarls as they lunged forward together, snow exploding beneath their paws. Tim grabbed another arrow from his hip quiver, fumbling with numb fingers as the wolves closed the distance, eyes gleaming with wild rage. He loosed a second shot at point-blank range, the arrow slashing across a wolf's shoulder, sending it yelping into the brush, but the others surged around him, jaws snapping. He swung his bow like a club, smashing one wolf across the muzzle, feeling its teeth rake across his thigh through thick hunting pants, hot pain flaring where claws tore into flesh. Blood soaked through the fabric as he staggered sideways, desperately trying to keep his feet on the icy ground. He dropped his bow and drew the 6-inch hunting knife from his belt, slashing at a lunging wolf's throat, warm blood spraying across his gloved hands as the animal crumpled at his feet. The last two wolves circled warily, growling deep in their chests, eyes fixed on Tim as he panted, knife held low and ready. His breath roared in his ears and his vision tunneled, every nerve screaming with the need to survive. He stepped toward them, yelling with every ounce of strength, waving the knife and kicking snow as he advanced. One wolf flinched, tail tucking as it turned and bolted into the timber, the second hesitating before following with a final, defiant snarl. Tim stood trembling in the sudden silence, knife slick with blood, lungs burning in the freezing air, ears straining for any sign they might return. Minutes passed before he dared lower his guard. Blood dripped steadily from the deep gashes on his thigh, staining the snow-dark red, pain radiating with every heartbeat. He sank to his knees, fumbling through his pack for a bandage, teeth clenched against the agony as he wrapped his leg as tightly as he could. He forced himself to stand, leaning against the meat tree for support, knowing he had to get back to his truck several miles away before shock or blood loss overwhelmed him. Every step back through the quiet forest was a battle, each crunch of snow behind him sending spikes of panic through his chest, every shadow a reminder of how close he had come to death. As the morning sun rose higher, pale light filtering through the tall pines, Tim limped toward safety, his body battered but spirit unbroken, carrying with him a newfound respect for the raw, unpredictable power of the wilderness and the thin line separating hunter from hunted. Mark Jensen had been hunting black-tailed deer in Oregon's dense coastal forests for over 15 years, drawn year after year by the challenge of tracking the elusive deer through fog-shrouded hills and tangled underbrush. At 41, with years of experience in rain-soaked timber, he considered himself prepared for anything the forest could throw at him. He carried a weatherproof .308 rifle, a compass, GPS unit, fire starting kit, and enough layers to handle the unpredictable autumn weather that could turn from gentle drizzle to driving rain in minutes. October's deer season was his favorite time of year, when the woods glowed with fiery fall colors and the rut brought black-tailed bucks into daylight. The morning had started perfectly, the forest alive with drifting mist and the soft patter of rain on broadleaf maples. Mark had spotted fresh tracks crossing an old logging trail and followed them deep into the timber, every sense tuned to the forest's subtle signs. He moved silently through ferns and fallen logs, pausing to glass shadowy thickets for the flicker of a blacktail's white-tipped tail, or the subtle sway of antlers brushing branches. Hours passed as he trailed the deer, the excitement of fresh sign pushing him farther from familiar landmarks. By late afternoon, the fog thickened into a low, suffocating blanket that transformed the forest into a maze of indistinguishable ridges and gullies. Mark realized he had pushed far beyond his usual hunting grounds, his mind focused so intently on tracking that he hadn't paid enough attention to his surroundings. He pulled out his GPS only to see the display flashing a low battery warning before dying entirely, leaving him with no clear sense of direction in the dim, dripping woods. He tried to get his bearings with his compass, but couldn't find a clear line of sight through the oppressive fog, every tree looking identical in the soft, silver gloom. Panic stirred in his chest as he retraced his steps, only to find each game trail blending into countless others, their muddy twists looping back on themselves. His heart pounded harder when he realized the daylight was fading fast, the dim gray shifting to deep blue as dusk settled over the forest. He pushed himself to move faster, stumbling through thick salal and brambles that tore at his camo pants, breathing hard as he called on every skill he had learned over years of hunting. But each direction he chose only seemed to carry him deeper into unfamiliar timber, the fog swirling thicker as night fell. As darkness swallowed the forest, Mark finally accepted he would have to spend the night where he was. He found a small rise above a tangle of ferns and set his pack down, forcing himself to breathe slowly and think clearly. He gathered damp branches and twigs, using his fire starter to coax a flickering flame to life despite the persistent drizzle. The tiny fire sputtered but held, casting weak, dancing light over the surrounding trees. He built it carefully, adding wood bit by bit to keep it alive, knowing it was his only hope of warmth and a way to keep predators at bay. As the hours crawled by, the forest around him felt both suffocating and vast. Coyotes howled in the distance, their eerie cries echoing through the dark timber and tightening the knot of fear in his chest. He strained to listen beyond the fire's crackle for the soft footfalls of black bears or cougars that prowled these woods. His thoughts turned to his family, waiting for him at home, their faces swimming before his eyes as exhaustion dragged at his limbs. He fought sleep, knowing he needed to stay alert, but his mind drifted in and out of uneasy dozes, every snap of a branch jolting him awake with heart-pounding dread. Rain fell more heavily in the early morning hours, hissing on the fire and soaking through the hood of his jacket as he curled closer to the fading warmth. His hands grew numb despite his gloves, and he forced himself to flex his fingers and toes, fighting off creeping cold that threatened to sap his will. He checked his rifle repeatedly, comforted by its solid weight, even if it felt like a fragile shield against the black expanse of night. He imagined every dark shape beyond the fire, his eyes watching him, the forest alive with unseen dangers waiting for him to falter. When dawn finally broke, the sky lightened to a sullen gray that barely penetrated the fog. Mark rose stiffly from his damp bed of moss and needles, legs trembling as he shouldered his pack and rifle. His fire had burned down to embers, a faint orange glow in the wet earth. He set out slowly, choosing the steepest downhill path in hopes of finding a creek or road. His compass needle swung wildly in the thick fog, but he trusted gravity to guide him toward lower ground, reasoning that most logging roads followed valleys. Hours later, he finally stumbled onto a muddy, rutted road cutting through alders, relief washing over him in a dizzying wave. He followed it until he heard the distant hum of an engine, waving both arms until a logging truck rounded the bend and skidded to a stop beside him. The driver's eyes widened at his mud-streaked, exhausted figure, but Mark barely noticed, too overwhelmed by the knowledge that he had survived the night in a forest that could swallow a man whole. Though he had hunted these woods for years, his night lost in the fog taught him a humbling lesson about the raw, unpredictable power of the wilderness and the need for respect and preparation every time he stepped under the forest's ancient canopy. Daniel Fournier had been moose hunting in Quebec's vast forest every autumn since he was 20. But the morning of October 4th would test every skill and instinct he had honed over decades in the wild. At 58, with a face weathered by years of frost and sun, he felt a rush of anticipation each time he stepped into the dense northern woods during the early October rifle season, when bull moose were at the peak of the rut. This year he hunted with his brother Luke, who at 49 was just as passionate and experienced. They had set up at first light near a swampy clearing, a favored spot for calling in bulls that search for cows among the low willows and tamaracks. The morning air was cold and still, the forest silent except for the distant drumming of a woodpecker. Daniel's breath hung in pale clouds as he cupped his hands around his mouth and let out a deep nasal cow call, the sound echoing off the trees and drifting into the mist. Minutes later, a low grunt rolled back through the timber, the unmistakable challenge of a mature bull. Daniel felt adrenaline surge as the grunting grew louder, accompanied by the steady crash of brush as the animal closed the distance, drawn by the promise of a mate and ready to fight for it. He and Luke crouched beside a fallen log, rifles raised and eyes scanning the dark tree line. Daniel's .338. Winchester Magnum felt heavy but reassuring in his hands, loaded with 250 grain rounds meant to stop a charging moose if things went wrong. The bull appeared without warning, stepping into the clearing like a nightmare made flesh. A massive animal with dark, matted fur, eyes wild with rut-crazed fury, and antlers spanning well over 5 feet, each tine sharp and glinting with morning dew. The bull's breath steamed from its nostrils as it swayed its head, grunting deep in its chest, muscles rippling beneath thick hide. Instead of pausing to assess the intruders, the bull lowered its head and came straight for them, each step deliberate and heavy, the ground trembling as it picked up speed. Daniel knew immediately something was wrong. The bull wasn't posturing or bluffing, it was attacking with deadly intent, its mind clouded by rage. He shouldered his rifle, sighted quickly on the massive chest, and squeezed the trigger. The shot thundered through the woods, the recoil driving the butt hard into his shoulder, but the bull barely staggered, blood spraying from its side as it kept coming. Luke fired as well, his own shot punching through the bull's shoulder, but the animal roared, a guttural, furious sound that filled the clearing as it barreled into fallen branches and shattered saplings. Daniel cycled his bolt frantically, chambering another round as the bull crashed closer, eyes rolling with madness. The brothers tried to retreat, but the wet ground sucked at their boots, every step an agonizing effort as the bull's hooves pounded the earth, closing the last 20 yards in seconds. The moose swung its massive antlers, striking Luke across the ribs and sending him sprawling into the mud with a pained cry. Daniel fired again, the bullet slamming into the bull's chest at point-blank range, but the impact only enraged the beast further. The bull reared back and brought its hooves down where Luke had fallen, splintering branches and spraying dark muck. Daniel shouted and waved his arms, drawing the bull's attention back to him, heart hammering as he realized he was now the only thing standing between his brother and certain death. The bull lunged, and Daniel threw himself sideways behind a rotting stump, the moose's hooves slamming into the ground where he'd been a heartbeat before. Mud exploded around him as he rolled, shouldering his rifle again and firing into the bull's broad chest. This time, the shot broke something vital. The bull staggered, legs buckling beneath its massive weight as it bellowed a final, strangled cry. It crashed onto its side with a thundering impact, dead silence following as birds took flight in a cloud of wings above the clearing. For a moment, neither brother moved. Daniel's ears rang with the echoes of gunfire, chest heaving with ragged breaths as he crawled to Luke's side. His brother's face was pale, eyes wide with shock but alive, ribs throbbing painfully but not broken. Together they sat beside the bull's enormous, lifeless form, the clearing littered with torn branches and churned mud, the air thick with the smell of blood and gunpowder. Daniel looked at the bull's rack, a trophy any hunter would admire, but all he felt was a deep, hollow exhaustion. As the sun climbed higher, they checked each other's injuries and began the grim task of field dressing the bull, every movement careful and deliberate, their hands shaking from adrenaline and lingering fear. Daniel's thoughts drifted to how quickly things had spiraled from excitement to a life-or-death struggle, and he understood more clearly than ever the thin line hunters walked when they entered the wilderness. One moment they were predators, calling and stalking with confidence, and the next they were prey, vulnerable to the raw, untamed power of an animal defending its territory. They worked in silence, cutting and quartering the massive animal, hanging the meat to keep it safe from scavengers, and making plans for how to get Luke back to camp with his bruised ribs. Every time Daniel glanced at the bull's eyes, now dull and lifeless, he felt a shiver of respect and a somber gratitude for surviving the encounter. The forest was beautiful, but it demanded humility, and he vowed never to forget how quickly nature could remind even the most experienced hunter who truly ruled the wild. Rick Carlson had hunted Michigan's forests every November since he was 16, drawn each year by the crisp autumn air, the rustle of fallen leaves, and the thrill of tracking white-tailed bucks during firearm season. Now 51, with a lifetime of knowledge etched into his weathered face, he moved with quiet confidence through the hardwoods, his blaze orange vest bright against the gray trunks of oaks and maples. The first light of dawn slipped through skeletal branches, glinting off his well-used .306 bolt-action rifle as he picked his way along a deer trail that wound through thick underbrush, ears attuned to every snap of twigs or crunch of leaves. He had glassed a large buck the evening before, spotting it skirting the edge of a swamp just before sunset, and spent the night in his camper plotting the perfect route to intercept it. He rose before 4 a.m., the excitement of the hunt washing away the morning's chill as he hiked deeper into the woods, boots sinking into wet leaves, breath curling in clouds that faded among the dark trees. Rick was careful and methodical, pausing often to check the wind, knowing a single careless step could spook the buck he dreamed of tagging for years. As the pale sun rose higher, he settled against the base of a massive oak, scanning the forest floor with binoculars. The world hushed except for the distant caw of a crow and the occasional snap of isolated branches falling to the ground. Hours passed with no sign of the buck, but Rick was patient. Deer hunting had taught him that persistence was often rewarded. He sipped water, checked his compass, and shifted only slightly to keep blood flowing in his legs. When the forest fell utterly silent, it took him a moment to notice how wrong it felt. Even the crows had gone quiet, leaving only the hollow whisper of wind through bare branches. A rustle of leaves behind him sent a bolt of alarm down his spine. He turned slowly, expecting a deer, but instead saw a figure stepping from the shadows, a man clad in mismatched camouflage, face obscured beneath a ragged hood and carrying a battered rifle across his chest. Rick's heart rate spiked as he registered the lack of blaze orange, the man's movements deliberate and unsettlingly silent. The stranger stopped 20 yards away, staring without a word, posture loose but eyes watchful, his rifle pointed casually but ready. Rick knew every hunter in this area respected the orange requirement. Seeing someone armed, alone, and unmarked felt like a warning. He kept his rifle lowered, but his thumb brushed the safety, every instinct screaming that something was off. He nodded in silent acknowledgement, a hunter's greeting, but the man didn't respond. Instead, he took a slow step closer, boots crunching on leaves. Rick called on every lesson from a lifetime in the woods to stay calm, fighting the primal fear rising in his chest. He shifted to keep the oak at his back, mind racing through options. Retreat would expose him, confrontation could escalate into tragedy, and waiting felt like surrender. The stranger shifted his weight, eyes flicking over Rick's gear, resting briefly on the sidearm, holstered at his hip before returning to his face. The forest felt suffocatingly small, every groan of tree trunks in the breeze magnified in the silence. Rick forced himself to breathe evenly, scanning for signs of aggression in the man's posture. His gloved finger hovered near his rifle's trigger guard, ready but not yet committed. He wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding, but the stranger's stillness radiated an unsettling intensity that made the hair on Rick's neck stand on end. Long minutes stretched between them, each second heavier than the last. Rick's mind replayed stories of confrontations gone wrong in the woods, arguments over stands, disputes about trespassing, and the rare but real violence that could erupt far from help. He tried to project calm authority, shoulders squared, feet planted firmly, showing he would not be an easy target. The stranger shifted again, glancing over his shoulder into the woods as if checking for someone unseen. Rick's gut twisted at the thought he might not be alone, eyes darting through the trees for a hint of movement. A sudden gust of wind rattled dead leaves across the forest floor, breaking the spell of silence. The man took 2 quick steps backward, eyes still locked on Rick's, before melting into the shadows with predatory grace. Within seconds he was gone, footsteps fading into the thick underbrush until only the normal sounds of the forest returned, tentative and uncertain. Rick waited, every muscle coiled, straining to catch any sign of return, but the woods slowly resumed their indifferent rhythm, birds calling hesitantly as if testing the quiet. When he was sure the man was gone, Rick forced himself to move, legs shaky as adrenaline drained from his body. He checked his gear, adjusted his vest, and chose the most direct route back to his truck, eyes scanning every shadow, ears tuned for the faintest sound. Each step felt vulnerable, the forest that once felt like a second home now charged with menace. He kept his rifle at the ready, mind replaying every detail of the encounter with a rising sense of unease. He wondered if the man was lost, confused, or something far more dangerous. When he reached the safety of his truck, he locked the doors, sat behind the wheel with his hands shaking, and took a long, steadying breath. He would never forget the cold intensity of those eyes, or the silent weight of that encounter deep in the Michigan woods. The forest, he knew, was a place of beauty and danger in equal measure, a place that demanded respect, caution, and an understanding that sometimes the greatest threat wasn't the animals lurking in the shadows, but other men.